Hi everyone, my name is Ben and welcome back to Fantasy F1 Tips, your home for the latest news, insights and thoughts on Fantasy Formula 1. This week I'll be talking through my review of the Dutch Grand Prix, I'll share some news and info in advance of this weekend's Italian Grand Prix, and I'll show the current plans for my Fantasy F1 team. Let's get into it. Let's start by reviewing a crazy race in the Netherlands this weekend. A wet dry track in qualifying followed by mixed conditions in the race left 186 overtakes on Sunday. The chaos with the rain falling from laps 1 to 3 completely switched up the grid, giving some crazy Fantasy Formula 1 scores for the weekend. Whilst the race was a great watch, I was unfortunate with my fantasy team, having missed out on Alonso's 62-point haul and having one of the drivers who crashed. I got 304 points overall, which shot me down from 156th to 1,377th in the overall rankings. Let's look at the team in more detail. Verstappen earned his record-equalling 9th consecutive win in Zandvoort and earned 46 points, doubled to 92 points with my DRS boost. He started on pole and won the race, but also managed 11 overtakes after falling back at the start of the race, pitting on lap 2 rather than on lap 1. Perez earned 30 points, moving from 7th in qualifying to 4th in the race, alongside 11 overtakes, most of which were on lap 3 as Perez's early call to switch to intermediates worked out. Norris ended up on 25 points, even though he dropped from 2nd to 7th in the race due to his 15 overtakes. Piastri also ended up with 18 points, even though he qualified in 8th and finished in 9th with 14 overtakes. So even though Perez, Norris and Piastri earned what would be decent points for a normal weekend, my rank drop was mainly due to not having Alonso, who scored 62 points this weekend, with 15 overtakes, a second place finish, plus 2 10-point bonuses for the fastest lap and the driver of the day. These bonuses are always difficult to predict and therefore hard to make team decisions around. Whilst Alonso is always a good pick, I do maintain that Norris and Perez were also strong picks for the weekend, and the team strategy calls are what made the big difference rather than the quality of the cars themselves, although I must say that Alonso's drive was outstanding this week. I'll have to consider moving forwards how I choose between Alonso, Perez and Norris, as I can only afford 2 of them per race. Sargent was the other killer for my team. After a brilliant qualifying into 10th place, he crashed in the tricky conditions on Sunday, leaving him on negative 18 points. Compared to Hulkenberg's 11 points and Lawson's 19, this choice left me around 30 points down. Again, I think this is unfortunate as anyone could have crashed in that race with the conditions. However, Sargent qualified 10th in the Williams and had already dropped back in the field before the crash. Therefore, Hulkenberg and Lawson would probably have been a better pick, given their car quality prevented them from qualifying further up. Red Bull ended up on 101 points and McLaren on 56. Aston Martin and Alpine both slightly outscored the McLaren by 11 and 10 points respectively, but again this was down to McLaren's poor strategy calls rather than the car performance, and then would have been difficult to predict before the race. Overall, a difficult drop in the leaderboard for my team this week due to an unpredictable and high quality race. Lots to think about for the next race coming up this weekend. Let's now look at the preview for this weekend's race at Monza. First thing to note for this weekend is the price changes. 16 drivers and 7 constructors have increased in price this week. The key ones being Alonso, who has increased by 1.5 million to 13.4 million in total, bringing him closer to Norris's 14.9 million price. Gasly has increased by 1 million to 10 million in total, taking him above Piastri's price and 0.1 million below Stroll. All other drivers below 15 million have increased by 0.5 million this week, except for those that crashed, Sargent and Zhou. This has now priced out Hulkenberg and Lawson for my team, but if you owned any that increased in price, it may bring more drivers as options for you. Aston Martin also increased in price compared to McLaren by 0.5 million, so there is now just a 1.3 million price difference between the 2 constructors. Now onto the track. Monza is known as the Temple of Speed, with long high-speed straights and few corners that are mostly low speed. Red Bull with its DRS should continue to be strong here, as should Williams, who have had strong weekends at the other long straight tracks this year, such as Canada. It is possible to overtake at Monza, but doesn't usually have the most overtakes of the year. Having said that, we just had 186 overtakes at a Dutch Grand Prix that usually has well under 30, so these things can be difficult to predict. There's also another tyre test in qualifying for Monza, where drivers will use hard tyres in Q1, medium in Q2 and soft in Q3. This caused some issues for teams in Hungary and had both Alfa Romeos qualifying in the top 10, so keep an eye out for a potential final fix chip if a driver qualifies particularly high or particularly low down. Finally, with 2 underperforming weekends now for McLaren at Spa and Zandvoort, should we be changing the template to fit more informed drivers like Alonso, Albon and Gasly into our teams, especially when the McLaren's straight line speed and slow corners aren't their strong suits? Let's have a look at my team for the Italian Grand Prix. Verstappen I plan to DRS boost. I fully expect him to get his 10th victory in a row this week and I don't see anyone in particular outscoring him. I'm also keeping Red Bull and McLaren as my constructors. Even if Aston Martin have caught McLaren in terms of the best cheap constructor, this will show in the performance of Alonso versus Norris. However, due to Stroll continuously performing so poorly, I think McLaren as a constructor are still the better bet. Currently the rest of my team is a bit stuck after that with 0.0 million in the bank. Therefore there's a chance that I will end up keeping the rest of the drivers and sticking to the triple Red Bull and triple McLaren template. Perez should perform well in the Red Bull at Monza. He hasn't been the best in qualifying all year, but with the Red Bull DRS on the straights, he should at least finish with a podium. I don't think Monza is best suited for the McLaren as they prefer the medium to high speed corners, but I still expect both Norris and Piastri to qualify in the top 10 and perform well. The only driver near Norris's price is Alonso, who I could be tempted by if Aston Martin looks strong in practice. Piastri I still think is a better option than those around his price. If I switched him for anyone, it would be to Albon, who could do well this week in the Williams. Finally, Sargent I would like to remove, but as I have no budget, I can only do this if I make another transfer elsewhere, as Sargent is the cheapest driver on the grid. Of the budget drivers, I generally think Tsunoda and Zhou are the best picks. Overall, I'm relatively happy with my team, other than not having Alonso or Albon and being stuck with Sargent. Let's have a look at some potential transfers that could help that. So my first potential transfer is Perez to Alonso and Sargent to Albon. This transfer lets me switch Sargent to Albon, which I predict to have a big impact on points this week, but would lose Perez from my team. Whilst Alonso got a huge 62 points in Zandvoort, Perez outscored him in the 6 races in a row before that. Perez is still the second strongest pick in Fantasy F1 behind Verstappen, and so it would be difficult for me to drop him. The second transfer option would have me dropping Norris for Alonso and then upgrading Sargent to Tsunoda. This switch from Norris to Alonso would only be done if the Aston Martin clearly looks like the stronger of the two teams after seeing Friday's practice. Both Norris and Alonso are having brilliant seasons and perform well when their car is on form. Since the updates to the McLaren in Austria, Norris has outscored Alonso in every race except the unpredictable Zandvoort this week. Tsunoda is my current pick of the cheap drivers, but I would also check to see which team is expected to qualify at the back of the field and has a decent race pace, as this is always the best option for the budget driver, due to F1 Fantasy giving 1 point per overtake and an additional 1 point per place improvement in the race versus qualifying. The final option that I could have for my transfers is Piastri out for Albon and Sargent and Tsunoda. This is currently my most likely option, switching out the second drivers at McLaren and Williams for the first drivers at Williams and AlphaTauri. Piastri has looked strong in the past few weeks and has been unfortunate a couple of times not to get more Fantasy F1 points. A late safety car in Silverstone, a crash from Sainz in Spa, and poor McLaren strategy keeping him on the softs on a wet track in the Netherlands. However, he is still a second driver and does not score as many points as Norris when the car is at its best. Albon, on the other hand, consistently outperforms the Williams. With the upgrades, he managed to qualify 4th in a Williams at Zandvoort, where he thought the car was going to be at one of their weakest tracks. At their expected strongest track of the year in Monza, could he go a step further into the top 3? If so, it would be great to fit him into the team. If Williams are that strong, you could argue it's worth keeping Sargent as well, but I think the chance of Sargent dropping back positions in the race due to slow race pace or crashing is too high for it to be worth the risk. Albon, on the other hand, if he can qualify up the grid, I think there's a decent chance he could stay there on Sunday and earn a lot of Fantasy F1 points. My worry would be if I move from the triple McLaren and triple Red Bull template, any price changes after this week would lock me out of getting back into it. Overall, I have currently made no transfers and will wait to see the practice statistics released from Formula 1 on Friday evening after the practice sessions. However, my most likely action is either to stick with the current team or switch out Piastri and Sargent for Albon and Tsunoda. Look out for an update on this from myself on Saturday morning. So that's my team for the Italian Grand Prix. Thanks for watching the video this week. As always, look out for the performances in Friday's practice before making your transfers if possible. Let me know your transfer plans for this race week and leave a comment below with your thoughts. If you've enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a like and subscribe to see tips for future F1 races. This has been Fancy F1 Tips, and I'll see you in the next one.